Thank you. Morning, folks. How are you? The book that I wrote about Aldous Huxley is really, on the cover it says it's a biography, and it was originally written as a spiritual biography. So it describes his spiritual development. And since Huxley was a save the world guy, then it became a save the world kind of book. So something stronger in many ways than just a biography. Today I'm going to talk specifically about his aesthetic theory, what he thought art does, what good is it. So we'll spend some time with that, and then I'll make some broader assessments of Huxley for you, because he was an important acharya for the center that we're now in today. He spent a lot of time here, lectured in this room. And so I'll make some broader comments about Huxley at the end. How many people have read some Aldous Huxley? I see some hands. I'm curious. How many people have read a book by Aldous Huxley that isn't Brave New World? Okay, that's still a few. That's good. I'm glad to see that. I'm really happy to see that. I first became aware of Aldous Huxley by reading Brave New World. In 1969 at Western Connecticut State University, where I was majoring in protesting the Vietnam War, I had a class. What we did is there were 5 of us living in a 2-bedroom apartment, and we took 5 classes, and the 5 of us took the same 5 classes, and we drew out of a hat which one we would actually take. And then you'd take one course, and then you would tutor the other 4 guys for the midterm and the final. And so out of the hat came an Intro to Philosophy course in which we read Brave New World. So Kismet, or Karma, led me to read Aldous Huxley for the first time, and I became intrigued by that. One thing that was interesting about that fall in which I read Brave New World is that that same fall I also became introduced to Vedanta. And the way that that happened is I went to the hardware store, Meeker's Hardware Store on White Street in Danbury, Connecticut. And again, this is in the fall of '69, and I was standing at the counter, and I'm from very, very rural coastal Maine near the Canadian border, a little fishing village called Millbridge. I had not been exposed to much of the world. Didn't know how to use a public bus. Didn't know how to use a pay telephone. There's a character in Brave New World called John the Savage, and my roommates used to call me that. So anyway, there I am, and I'm standing in Meeker's Hardware, and there's a man beside me wearing a dress, is what it looks like to me. And he had very long hair, and so did I. It was the 60s. And, but I thought the dress was interesting. And to come to find out, this was Swami Satchidananda. Maybe some of you have heard of him. Had his Mahasamadhi this last year. And he was in a slightly agitated state, so he sort of spilled over the side to me, and he goes, "Do you realize that I have just now gotten a speeding ticket?" And I said, "No, how would I know?" And he says, "I don't understand it." I said to him, "Mr. Cop, this car is called Thunderbird. If you don't want me to go fast, why do you call all your cars after a fast thing? Thunderbird, Mustang, Cougar, you're calling it." He said, "Why don't you call it Snail? You could call it Tortoise. Then it would go slowly." He said, "So he is giving me a ticket." I said, "Mr. Cop, please, I don't have any pockets, there's no money. Please don't do it." But he did. So I don't know what he was in Meeker's Hardware Store for, but anyway, I got talking with him and started to do integral yoga in Danbury, Connecticut. One of the keyboard player in a band called the Young Rascals, and some of you are old enough to remember that band. He was a devotee of Swami Satchidananda. So that sort of began me on a path of interest in Advaita, and in some sense today, I'm a cousin that you've never met. In graduate school, I was very interested in the Dundee sannyasins, who are a sect of renunciates very closely related to Ramakrishna sect. And I traveled around with them, and they're called Dundies because they carry a dunda. And dunda is the Sanskrit word for stick or staff. And they carry a bamboo staff with them. It can never touch the ground. It's not a walking stick. It's as tall as them, but they have to carry it as an emblem of their renunciation. So like a string tied around your finger to remind yourself of something, they always have this stick. Why am I carrying this stupid thing around? Oh, I'm a monk. So I would wander around following them. I think they were surprised to find out they had a groupie, especially a Westerner. But here I am with, all my clipboards and my cameras and tape recorders following them around for a very long time. And so I spent a lot of time meditating with them and a lot of time learning about Advaita Vedanta in a non-academic setting. Okay, I like teaching. I've taught for a very long time now. I enjoy that. Academic research tends to bore me. At some point I seem to have given up on the idea. Around 50, you make those corrections in your life, and I seem to have decided that I no longer wanted to write papers that 10 people read and 8 of them understand and 6 of them disagree with you. That was boring. So the idea was, okay, I'm going to try to write something for the popular press, and Aldous Huxley floated up in the crazy 8-ball of my brain, and that was what I wanted to write about. And a couple of reasons why that happened. He wrote 50 books. He was an extremely influential thinker for a couple of generations, but he seems to be being forgotten today. And a graphic illustration of that for me was I brought the manuscript for this book about Aldous into a Kinko's in Portland, Maine, and I had the manuscript, and he was going to make copies for my editor. And when he was finished writing up the order, he said, and this is a man maybe late 20s, 30 years old, articulate, clearly educated, and he said, I'll have this order for you on Friday, Mr. Huxley. Oh. And I said, well, actually, I'm not Aldous Huxley. And he had never heard of Aldous Huxley. I have that happen quite often with my undergraduate students. And what's interesting about it, teaching philosophy and religion, is sometimes something will come out of your mind. I'll say something. Reason tells me I'm nothing. Love tells me I'm everything. Between those two poles, my life unfolds. And a student will say, wow, that's amazing. What a great idea. And they'll come up after to copy it down, and I'll have to point out, you know what? I didn't think it up. That's not me, that was, in this case, Kalu Rinpoche, a Tibetan teacher, but, Plato, Immanuel Kant. I can't take credit for all of this. And Huxley is somebody that students, young people, are really strongly drawn to. And his ideas about Advaita Vedanta in particular, they're very strongly drawn to the ideas. But the irony is they don't know who he is, and they don't know what tradition those ideas came from. So there's something for me to contemplate. And hopefully the book will help a bit. It's short. It's only a couple hundred pages long, not a big read, not a doorstop. And hopefully it will do something in that regard. Let me give you a little bit of background about Huxley, a very little bit. He was born in 1894 in England into a very famous and prestigious family of intellectuals. He was born just a few years after the Eiffel Tower was created, the tallest human-made structure in history. And it was a time that Joseph Wood Crouch, right at the end of the 19th century, called the Age of Confidence. There was a tremendous confidence in Western civilization that we could be anything and we could do anything. And the tool that was going to get the job done was science. The epistemology of science, the means of knowing of science, delivered such tremendous power to our civilization that we thought it might do everything. By the end of the First World War, some of that enthusiasm had been eroded. It could bring good things, but it could also bring machine guns and mustard gas and aerial bombing. And there were other reasons why there was a loss of confidence in what science and technology could do. And that was that it seemed to erode traditional values, but it didn't seem to be able to create any new foundation of meaning. It didn't seem to be able to articulate any new values. It suggested there is no meaning to our existence because it can't find or prove one. It suggested that all values are relative, that all values are culturally created, and that the universe is ultimately a moral vacuum. Is it true? Huxley didn't think so. Huxley argued that it just might be revealing of the limitations of reason and science as methods for knowing truth and meaning. That the epistemology itself predisposed certain negative outcomes. You know the old expression, or maybe you don't, in Maine we have a lot of old expressions. And one of them is, if the only tool you have is a hammer, then every problem looks like a nail. And so the epistemology, through the lens of science, only certain possibilities loomed up. Huxley himself once wrote, promoting their epistemological ineptitude to the rank of a criterion of truth, dogmatic scientists have often branded everything beyond the pale of their limited competence, as unreal or even impossible. Positivists assume that the problems they can't solve really have no answer. Specifically, science tends to throw out what it can't quantify. If it isn't measurable, it must therefore not exist or have value. What disturbed Huxley about this is that most of what we find in life to be meaningful can't be measured or quantified. E.F. Schumacher once said, only those questions which cannot be answered with laboratory precision really have any significance. Last fall, my girlfriend Stephanie, my fiance, is here today. She and I were hiking in the White Mountains in New Hampshire, and it was a beautiful fall day. We have some days in New England in late September, early October, that if you've been there, they are life-changing. We're out in the woods and we're camping for several days, and we're going up a mountainside, and the sky was cobalt blue. The trees were on fire with yellows and reds and oranges and pinks, and really quite wonderful. And a huge blast of wind came up the side of the mountain, and all these leaves that we were in were dancing, and a lot of them blew off the tree, and they were literally swirling around us and blowing into us, this sort of maelstrom of color. It, in the vernacular of my generation, blew my mind. But what good was it? What measurable value did that experience have? For several days, every time I thought of it, a big smile came on my face at the beauty of it, how much it had filled me up. Did I experience 10 pounds of beauty, would you say? 32 linear feet of beauty entered Dana's brain that day? It isn't possible to quantify this sort of thing, but did it have meaning? Certainly I felt like it did. How about love? Does love have meaning? Is it quantifiable? Can you measure it? What tool do you use to measure it? You know, the loveometer? Some people maybe, if we reduce love to just what can be measured, mutual support of some financial kind, then maybe it can be quantified. I remember maybe a year or two ago, I was reading a New Yorker, and I only read the cartoons. Are you one of those people? I only read the cartoons. So I'm reading the cartoon, and there's one where a woman is weeping very strongly outside of a hospital operating room. And this doctor is trying to console her, and the caption underneath is, "Doctor, will he ever generate revenue again?" Oh. And I thought, well, for her, love is quantifiable. Maybe for her it is, but for many of us it isn't. I teach at a college of art. How about art? What do you get from art? When this beautiful organ music was playing earlier today, And I'm not patronizing you. That was really beautiful, beautiful. Did you get something? Yes. Can you quantify what it was? No. Okay, Huxley believed that no philosophy worth believing in could contradict scientific facts. Facts are facts, whether you choose to ignore them or not. But though no philosophy worth believing in should contradict scientific facts, that doesn't mean that we must surrender to the limitations of science as a method of knowing. Do you understand? It's a good tool for certain kinds of jobs. Like a hammer is a good tool for certain kind of jobs. But sometimes a screwdriver is a better tool than a hammer, and you have to set the hammer down. And so Huxley felt that we were too addicted to that one tool. Okay? The guy that has the toolbox and he opens it up and there's just a hammer in it. All right. Why? Because if we conform life and meaning to only what science can quantify as good, see if you can follow this, we create a reductionism that herds us toward materialism. Why? Because science can only quantify material things. So things that aren't stuff can't be quantified, and art is one of them. If we try to quantify art, then art only becomes amusement, entertainment. What good is it? Oh, it's, that painting looks so nice over my sofa. Art is decoration. Nothing more edifying than that. What about happiness? If we quantify, if we only take what we can quantify as conducive to happiness, then happiness is equivalent to physical comfort and physical pleasure only. Huxley felt that was dangerous. He found this reductionism unacceptable and sought, as had his granduncle. Aldous Huxley's mother was Julia Huxley, but she had been Julia Arnold, and her uncle, her father's brother, was Matthew Arnold, the famous Victorian poet, one of the three most important Victorian poets, but also an essayist about moral values and virtue. Wrote a very brilliant book called Culture and Anarchy that I recommend. Anyway, like Matthew Arnold, Huxley was interested in finding a more humanistic foundation for our civilization than the reductionism that science urged us toward. He worried that equating meaning in life with only physical comfort and pleasure would move us toward vulgarity, shutting down our apprehension of the more sublime and deeper values of our existence. A contemporary of Matthew Arnold's was Henry David Thoreau, the New England transcendentalist. In Thoreau's wonderful chapter on economy in Walden, how many people have read Walden? I'm curious. That's good. We're doing well today. A lot better than my undergraduate students, you know. Okay, so in economy, Thoreau says that we have to establish our existence the way a plant does. We need to be physically comfortable to some extent. We need food, we need shelter, we need a place to live. That's like when we plant a seed in the ground, it establishes a root system. Once it's established its root system, it gets down to the real business of its existence, Thoreau says, which is breaking through the soil and reaching as a plant toward the sun. That's its higher destiny. Thoreau says that's how we are, that we need to have physical comfort to some extent as a foundation, as a launch pad for the deeper project of spiritual growth. A person who focuses their entire life only on physical comfort and pleasure is like a seed gone wrong. The seed that only keeps developing more and more elaborate root systems but never ever bothers to break the soil. So when Thoreau looked around Concord, Massachusetts at his time, and he saw people who just continuously were building bigger houses with more and more rooms, he felt he could get more of the real job done by living in a shack on the beach of Walden Pond. This is exactly the kind of argument Matthew Arnold made, and it rubbed off on Huxley. He was very strongly influenced by it. In 1927, in an essay called Comfort, this is what Aldous Huxley had to say. Comfort is a means to an end. The modern world seems to regard it as an end in itself, an absolute good. One day, perhaps, the earth will have been turned into one vast feather bed, with man's body dozing on top of it and his mind underneath, like Desdemona smothered. It's a sad thought, but it worried him. In fact, it worried him so much, I said he wrote this essay in 1927. In 1931, he wrote Brave New World. And Brave New World was a warning. It was a cautionary tale about what we would become if we reduced the good to only pleasure and comfort. It's always in print. Laura Huxley told me a couple of days ago that it still pays the rent. And I think that it pays the rent because it still rings true for us, that book. When we read 1984, we have this sort of Stalinist view of what our dark future could be, where we'd be controlled by a boot on our neck and forced to do things. And Huxley didn't think so. He thought we would surrender our freedoms and we would surrender our spirituality to pleasure itself, that we'd be pleasured into surrender. And I think this is why it rings more true for us today in a time of, I have a student who's convinced that they're aerially spraying Prozac. I sure hope not. But anyway, in a time when we are doing drugs like soma in the text, and at a time when there's so much television addiction. When the Sputnik went up in 1957, people started calling this the space age, and Huxley, with his usual cynicism, said, no, better to call it the age of television addiction. So in a time of video games and TV addiction and so much pleasuring, it tends to ring true for us. A time when avarice has become a virtue is a scary time. But what specifically should we be doing? If we're not fulfilling these sort of Freudian appetites and drives that are quantifiable for food, shelter, sex, what should we be doing? Well, later in the 50s, Abraham Maslow, the famous transpersonal psychologist, would say, we're writing up too short a list of what really drives the human psyche. Yes, we are driven for food, shelter, and sex, but not only. We're also driven for love. Love is a deep and strong drive in the human psyche, and to deny that is not realistic. People will often give up food and sex and shelter for love. It's a very profound drive. They will also, Maslow says, have a drive for self-actualization. That's his term, a kind of secular concept for enlightenment. We're driven to wake up. We feel like we're on one side of a screen, but there's more of us on the other side, and we want to get at it. Huxley agreed with that viewpoint completely. Maslow does very little to really explain, to give us a philosophical foundation for why we have these higher drives for love and self-actualization. That became most important for Aldous Huxley. From 1933, I would say, on, his primary goal was to find a philosophy that made sense of these higher drives. Why do we have this drive to self-actualize? The reason we need food and shelter is fairly straightforward. The mature theory he expressed in 1945 in a book called The Perennial Philosophy. That is a wonderful, amazing book. I was going to bring my copy when I flew out here from Maine, but the poor thing is in such a state of disrepair with elastic bands around it and a million Post-its that I let it rest. Anyway, he wrote it in 1945. In 1937, a last piece of history, he spent a lot of time right around here, within 50 yards of where I'm standing right now. And he spent a lot of time with Swami Prabhavananda and was very strongly influenced by him. And though he's talking about the perennial philosophy as a philosophy of humanity in a very broad sense, I argued in an article I recently wrote for the Aldous Huxley Annual, published in Germany, that his mysticism is closest to Advaita Vedanta. Very similar to Mahayana Buddhism, very close to Advaita Vedanta. And we see this very clearly if we look at his minimum working hypothesis in the book. In the book, he gives us the entire outline of the perennial philosophy in 4 little pieces. And these are the 4 pieces, and tell me if this isn't in perfect resonance with Vedanta. Part 1, that there is a Godhead or ultimate ground, which is the unmanifest principle of all manifestation. So he's talking about a divine ground the way Meister Eckhart did, but he's talking about the Brahman, which is the Atman. That the ground is transcendent and immanent. That's the second one. Advaitins often use the analogy of the ocean and the waves. I don't know if that's one that you folks use, but that the waves are individual and they're multiple, but they cannot be separated from ocean itself ultimately. So the transcendent is also immanent, as the ocean is immanent in the waves. And thirdly, that it is possible for human beings to love, know, and from virtually to become actually identified with the divine ground. And lastly, that to achieve this unitive knowledge, to realize this supreme identity, is the final end and purpose of human existence. For Huxley, this outlines the religion that is behind all religions. How many people know who Huston Smith is? Does that ring a bell, that name, Huston Smith? Huston Smith grew up in China, but he has kind of a Jimmy Stewart Midwestern kind of an accent. And he said in a lecture at Bates College at the University of Maine last year, he's also a perennial philosopher. He believes there's a primordial religion behind all the religions. He said, religion is like pants. Plural at the bottom, but singular at the top. And he's now 87 years old, and so he says, and at my age, I only want to talk about the waistband. So very much the same kind of view that Huxley had. The unitive knowledge is what causes the full self-actualization that Maslow talked about, according to Aldous Huxley. Yes? When the self, the relative self, knows itself as absolute, that's when the unitive knowledge is full self-actualization. A revolution in consciousness. So the unitive knowledge isn't something you know with your brain, like your boyfriend's phone number or your social security number. It's something that you know ontically, as philosophers say. You know it by being it, right? How is the unitive knowledge gained? How does one become identified with the divine ground? This is the place of the various yogas. I keep talking in shorthand. Is that working for you? Okay, good. I'm glad to hear that. I hoped I could anticipate that. For Huxley, art is a kind of yoga. It is a way. It is a means of stimulating the mind toward the unitive knowledge. In fact, his first spiritual experiences seem to have come completely through art, seeing art, being amazed by art. I don't know if you ever heard, but the French novelist Stendhal, there's a psychological condition called Stendhal syndrome, because in 1837, in Florence, seeing Michelangelo, Stendhal fainted at the beauty of it. Huxley had these kinds of powerful spiritual experiences looking at art. For him, it gives a glimpse of the absolute truth. He wrote in Themes and Variations in 1950, the aesthetic experience, so the art experience, is in some sort an analog of the mystical experience. By coming to know perfection in a work of art, we gain a kind of knowledge of the ultimate nature of things. Art is one of the means whereby man seeks to redeem a life which is experienced as chaotic, senseless, and largely evil. By itself, art can never be completely redemptive. It can only point in the direction from which redemption comes. It can only indicate at one remove the nature of the primordial and ineffable fact. And he capitalizes fact to make clear that he's talking about the divine ground itself. At the end of this quote, Huxley is pointing out that art is only a means to the truth and not a truth itself. And this is an axe he ground a lot. I'm not going to grind it for him right now. I talk about it in the book a bit. But he was very much suspect of people who claimed to have the way. He wasn't that sort of person. He believed there were many ways up the mountain, and that it's an extremely personal journey, as it necessarily must be, and that there are good ways, but there are lots of them. He often told the story about the Zen finger pointing at the moon. I don't know if you know that story. There's a story that two monks are walking up a mountain path, and a young monk looks ahead, and the old monk is standing on the path, and he's going like this, and he's pointing. And the young monk follows his arm, follows his finger, and over the branch of a pine tree, there's the full moon sitting, orange on the horizon. Sublime, beautiful. He's transfigured by the glory of the moon. And for Zen Buddhists, things like reading texts are like the Zen finger. They're only useful if they lead to the direct unitive experience. Reading the books and memorize them might just be a way of inflating your ego with how smart you are in an academic kind of way, and actually do you more harm than good. Because if you don't look at the moon, then you just get the finger. Right? That's all that's left. Don't stay with the finger, look at the moon. All right? So for Huxley, art was a way, but it was what it did that it communicated this powerful aesthetic, spiritual experience that was its real value. How does it work? How does art do this? How does it give us a glimpse of the sacred? In the perennial philosophy, while discussing the nature of the ground in chapter 2, Huxley points out the difficulty. And the difficulty is that since the divine ground, since the oneness, since the Brahman, has no relative qualities, the Upanishads say neti, neti, not this, not that, literally na iti, not this, not that. It isn't this, it isn't that, it isn't plaid, it isn't fuzzy. It doesn't have qualities like that. Unfortunately, it doesn't. Unfortunately, it's not quantifiable. You can't pass it to somebody in a box. I often lament that, actually. I wish I could mail some politicians about 20 pounds of Brahman sometimes. You ever feel like that? But unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. In Chuangzi, he says, listening, you cannot hear its sound, and gazing, you cannot see its form. But that doesn't mean it's not there, right? Huxley, similar to Hindus and Buddhist aesthetic theory, believed that forms could suggest it. That forms used by a great artist can springboard us into the formless. That by using the forms of words and writing, sounds and music, images and painting, they can create a matrix of form that when we put our consciousness on it, acts as a launch pad for us into something else, into something beyond form. This is what happened to Stendhal, is what Huxley's argument was. In Vedanta for Modern Man in 1945, a book published by you folks, Huxley wrote, "The aim in all cases of art is to give a form to the essentially formless." Aldous Huxley was very close friends with T.S. Eliot and rubbed off on him a lot. T.S. Eliot once wrote, "Only by the form, the pattern, can words or music reach the stillness." In Hindu culture, one of the words for artist, how are we doing? You with me?
Yes.
Okay, great. In Hindu culture, one of the words for artist is rasika. Rasa means essence. If you're in the bazaar and you want some juice, mujhe rasa chahiye. I want rasa, or ras in Hindi, ras. Santara ras. Orange juice. Thank you so much. You could tell I was dry, huh? I needed some essence. Santara ras, orange juice. But juice is the essence of the orange. So the essence of existence is what? Brahman. The infinite, the timeless. So an artist is a taster and appreciator of essence. And when they taste and appreciate, then they want to tell. They want to communicate that essence. So they're also conveyors of it. They bring us to it, or bring it to us. Anagarika Govinda, in his book Creative Meditation and Multidimensional Consciousness, I love those kind of grand titles. He says, the hidden way that leads to this source of meaning is the path of meditation and absorption. And the vessel in which the water of life is brought up to the surface is art. This is exactly in line with Huxley's aesthetic theory. We say that great art is timeless. Huxley believed this was because it transports us into the timelessness itself. Or to put it another way, it transports us into the timelessness of our own self. And that's why we love it. Huxley believed this is why art is so deeply important. The artist is a way, and art is a great medicine. He agrees with Beethoven, who once said, "There is no loftier mission than to approach the Godhead nearer than other people and to disseminate the divine rays among humanity." And that's what he sought to do with his music. In Huxley's introduction to Texts and Pretexts, an anthology of poetry that he wrote during the Great Depression, he begins by saying, "An anthology of poetry compiled in mid-slump? Fiddling, you protest indignantly, while Rome burns. But perhaps Rome would not now be burning if the Romans had taken a more intelligent interest in their fiddlers." He says, we tend to think and feel in terms of the art we like, and if the art we like is bad, then our thinking and feeling will be bad. And if the thinking and feeling of most of the individuals composing a society is bad, is not the society in danger? To sit on committees and discuss the gold standard are doubtless public-spirited actions, but not the only public-spirited actions. They also serve who only bother their heads about art. Okay. For him, art is a powerful yoga, a powerful meditation, because beauty is so irresistible, so engrossing. 2 or 3 times he alludes to a wonderful image, which is Krishna playing the flute. That if you've ever read Gita Govinda, or if you've read Srimad Bhagavatam, Harivamsa, the stories about Krishna playing the flute and how beautiful the music is, irresistible. The sounds coming out of the sacred are so enticing that they draw us in a powerful, powerful way. Sometimes maybe too powerfully. These sort of married gopi women going out the door. I must go. I must see Krishna. The husband's around their legs. Where are you going? You're married to me. No, I know, but he's so beautiful. The moth going to the light. But anyway, Huxley liked the power of that. Music, art can be such a powerful meditation for a person maybe less disciplined to sit in meditation. A very good platform for transcendence. But currently, from Huxley's perspective, a diamond being sold for the price of spinach. That in our culture, we really don't understand what art can do. We only see things as good which can be quantified. We can't quantify it. And so, my students often lament that in their high schools, the science program was funded first, but the art program usually came somewhere after the football team. Not really a very good appreciation for what art can really do and its spiritual importance for us today. And that leaves a vacuum. It leaves a vacuum because science can't do the job. And that's an important thing from Huxley's perspective. It's not trivial. Science can't do it. Science can't quantify that which transcends quantity. It'll never be able to stick its finger in Brahman. Art can. In the 19th century, very early, right at the turn of the 19th century, Immanuel Kant, in a book called Religion Beyond the Limit, Within the Limits of Reason Alone, he talks about the noumenon and the phenomenon. And for right now, in shorthand, let's equate the noumenon, the numinous, with Brahman, the spirit behind all things. And the phenomenon we're very used to. It's your lawn, your laundry, the world in which we live. And Kant says the intellect can never bridge to the noumenon. It can't intellectually know it. It can know it in an analogous kind of way, in the way that you could create a botanical description for a tree, but it isn't the same thing as the tree, right? Schelling, in 1802, wrote a book called The System of Transcendental Idealism. And he says, though the intellect can't bridge to the numinous, we still can. That we're capable of experiencing the noumenon, and that art, he said 200 years ago, was one of the bridges into the noumenon. And this is what Huxley completely believed in. So we're losing that bridge, or we don't validate that bridge enough in our culture. That's my opinion as well as Huxley's as a professor at an art college. And Saul Bellow, the famous American novelist, had this to say in his acceptance speech for the Nobel Prize in 1976. The intelligent public is waiting to hear from art what it does not hear from theology, philosophy, social theory, and what it cannot hear from pure science. A broader, fuller, more coherent, more comprehensive account of what we human beings are, who we are, and what this life is for. If artists do not come into the center, it will not be because the center is preempted. It is not. So there's a vacuum science can't fill that Huxley strongly believed art could, and that we're suffering for lack of. Still okay? What time do we have? Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't even see that. Isn't that how life is? You know what I'll do? We have a small amount of time. I want to read you a couple of quotes. You know, do you ever need advice for your refrigerator? You know, something to pin up on the wall, and you can look at it every now and then and go, oh boy, I needed to hear that one more time, you know. Huxley is somebody I kind of got all over my house. In fact, I got to get him out of my head. It's kind of, you know, I need a new book, definitely. I need to write about somebody else. The last 2 or 3 years have been, I'm dreaming about him, you know, you ever can imagine. Anyway, here's a couple that are on my refrigerator. You know, one time Huxley was asked, are there any shortcuts to good writing? And of course I got really interested. And he said, yeah, endless rewriting. And that's kind of how he saw the spiritual path, as you're about to see in this one quote. This is from a book that Gerald Hurd, a friend of his, who also spent a lot of time here, wrote, called Prayers and Meditations, and Huxley submitted some pieces for it. And here's a little piece of advice for your spiritual growth that he wrote down. From our natural state of incompleteness to spiritual health and perfection, there is no magically easy shortcut. The way to holiness is laborious and long. It lies through vigilance and prayer, through an unresting guard of the heart, the mind, the will, and the tongue, and through the one-pointed loving attention to God, which that guard alone makes possible. This second one for my refrigerator is from the last page of the last article that Aldous Huxley ever wrote. He dictated it on his deathbed in 1963, and the article was called Shakespeare and Religion. And this is what he had to say, his last page of writing. Our business is to wake up. We have to find ways in which to detect the whole of reality in the one illusory part which our self-centered consciousness permits us to see. We must not live thoughtlessly, taking our illusion for the complete reality. But at the same time, we must not live too thoughtfully in the sense of trying to escape from the dream state. We must continuously be on our watch for ways in which we may enlarge our consciousness. We must not attempt to live outside the world which is given to us, but we must somehow learn how to transform it and transfigure it. One must find a way of being in this world while not being of it, a way of living in time without being completely swallowed up in time. When I was traveling around with the Dundies, every day they do a puja, and then they do something called Dandatarpana. You don't need to know what that is. But as their puja began, they always began with the same prayer. And the prayer was, Apavitra pavitro va savavastangatopi va yasmare pundri kaksham sabayabhyam tarashuchi, which means whether pure or impure, whether permeated by purity or impurity, whoever opens himself to the expanded vision of unbounded awareness gains inner and outer purity. And ferreting out those moments where he could springboard into the infinite was what that whole life was about. That feels like enough.